Welcome, my distinguished colleagues, to this roundtable where we shall delve into the heart of one of modern gaming's most sprawling tapestries, Red Dead Redemption 2. We stand at the intersection where this digital frontier crosses paths with history, ethics, literature, and so much more.
Indeed, Hal. It's enthralling to consider how a video game can evoke the very essence of a bygone era that many of us have only encountered through the pages of history and literature.
And it's crucial, Amelia, to discuss how this game has possibly redefined what is achievable in terms of narrative complexity within a gaming medium. It's an unprecedented blend of interactive storytelling and player agency.
Absolutely, Lenny. The richness of the characters, especially marginalized ones, adds layers of depth that go beyond what we've typically seen in this genre. It's a culture-rich canvas begging for interpretation.
That interactivity you mentioned, Lenny, combined with the game's remarkable environmental detail, spotlights the power of technology in modern storytelling. It's like living inside a novel that's been given form and substance.
But as we weave through this digital tapestry, I urge us not to forget the roots, the historical threads that bind this game to the authenticity of the period it seeks to represent.
A valid point, Mick. The verisimilitude of any artwork claiming historical context cannot be overstated. It is our task to untangle the intricacies of this portrayal and examine its fidelity to the American frontier.
Permit me, though, to express some skepticism about the complete authenticity of such portrayals, which are frequently filtered through present-day sensibilities. A fact we must grapple with.
Skepticism, Izzy, is the hallmark of any critical discussion. Our pursuit, after all, is truth, or at least a version of it that resonates with both the past and present.
And let's not overlook the technological triumphs. The game is an outstanding testament to the intersection of art and science.
Yes, but let's be cautious of praising solely for tech's sake. For a narrative to truly resonate, it must transcend the brilliance of its medium.
Trust Lenny to remind us of our humility before we get carried away. So then, on that sobering note, shall we begin our journey through the wilds of Red Dead Redemption 2?
We shall indeed, my friends. Each of you is a torchbearer in your field, illuminating the path ahead. Our exploration promises to be as vast and challenging as the game world itself. Let's ride forth. Well, let's dive into the nuanced recreation of the American frontier in RDR2. Amelia, how do you see the game compared to the narratives of the Old West in literature?
The vistas and landscapes of RDR2 evoke that raw, wild spirit so vividly depicted by writers like Twain. However, I must say the game's narrative takes creative liberties, romanticizing the outlaw lifestyle in ways similar to penny dreadfuls of the era.
I agree about the romanticism, Amelia, but they got so much right anthropologically speaking. The rituals, the diversity of communities. Though I often find myself asking, is it too picturesque, Life was grittier, harsher than most quests let on.
Speaking of gritty, the technology might at times be too modern. Don't get me wrong, the weapons, the trains, they're mostly spot on, but occasionally something feels out of place, a bit too advanced.
I see what you mean, Jasper. It's a delicate balance for immersion, but such anachronisms, although rare, can indeed pull one out of the experience.
I see it as a narrative choice. Sure, we can nitpick the details, but what holds up is the feeling, the aura of the time. It's almost as if they resurrected the past.
Mick, you're right about the aura. The game's representation of domestic lives, social gatherings, they're immersive. Still, immersion doesn't excuse the occasional slip in historical accuracy.
Jasper has a point, yet I can't help but admire the narrative mastery here. The fact we're so captivated that we even notice these slips says something about its storytelling power.
Absolutely, Amelia. Captivation is key. And while some details are overstated or understated, the collective portrait is believably raw and nuanced.
And let's not overlook the economic and industrial contexts the game threads into its narrative. It celebrates and critiques the era in equal measures. That's tough to do right.
Heated agreement there, Jasper. It captures the zeitgeist, progress and decay, innovation and exploitation, all central to that period.
That's the magic of RDR2. It's a mirror to reflect a turbulent, defining chapter in American history. It uses the past to tell a story that feels timeless and honestly pertinent.
Well put, Amelia. While discrepancies exist, it's the spirit of the frontier RDR2 captures, a mosaic of myths and truths. Shall we delve into the morality woven into this tapestry in our next segment? Welcome back, everyone. The topic at hand now is the fascinating interplay of morality and ethics in RDR2's decision-making mechanics. The game indeed nudges us to ponder the gravity of our choices. Lenny, would you like to start us off with your thoughts on the game's moral compass system?
Absolutely, Hal. The moral compass system in RDR2 is superficially a measure of good and bad deeds, but philosophically, it's a canvas for existential freedom. The player's sense of agency is remarkably accentuated, serving up genuine moral dilemmas that wouldn't feel out of place in a Dostoevsky novel.
I'd have to agree with you on the existential aspect, Lenny, but also add that the game crafts a narrative where our choices resonate with the characters around us, reflecting the interconnectedness of society. It's not just about moral absolutism. It's the shades of gray that echo the complexities of human nature and relationships.
Well put, Izzy. Yet, it's the very shades of grey that sometimes feel illusory. In the end, choices often boil down to binary consequences. Surely the game could have been more nuanced in reflecting the ambiguity of ethical decision-making.
Those are valid points. Ethics are indeed a mosaic of grays rather than black and white. But don't you think the game at least attempts to mirror the messiness of moral life, even if it is bound by its own programming limitations?
You're making a great point there, Hal. And to Lenny's point, while I yearn for more nuance, I recognize that the binary outcomes serve a narrative purpose. Without them, the game might lose the dramatic impetus that drives the story forward.
I hope you don't mind me jumping in. From a literary perspective, I find that RDR2 employs morality in a way that evokes classical storytelling. It harks back to age-old narratives where heroes are faced with moral crossroads, and their decisions foil their character development. It's rather fascinating.
A poetic observation, Amelia, as always. However, let's not overlook that some of the moral binary can oversimplify complex socio-historical realities.
Indeed. Mick, what are your thoughts on this in relation to the historical contexts the game presents us with?
I'm grateful for the setup, Hal. It's crucial to remember the game's historical backdrop when discussing morality. The late 19th century American frontier was a crucible of competing moral codes, from Native American tribal laws to the encroaching ethics of an industrializing society. The game does a remarkable job at laying bare this historical moral struggle, though sometimes it oversimplifies or even misrepresents it.
Exactly, Mick. You see how that simplification may inadvertently diminish the struggles of marginalized people during that era. The game could potentially create an echo chamber of contemporary moral judgments without an authentic avenue for understanding historical ones.
Whilst I cannot help but agree, the game is, in essence, a present-day creation, and one can argue that it is inevitably interpreted through the lens of our current moral compass. Can we truly fault it for not fully capturing the moral complexity of a bygone era?
Lenny's contention brings us back to the realm of literary criticism, the debate between historical authenticity and creative adaptation. While it's important to strive for truthfulness, RDR2, like any work of fiction, must engage a modern audience, and thus it translates, or sometimes even transforms, historical morality for contemporary sensibilities.
I must say, this has been a thoroughly provoking discussion. But before we draw it to a close, are there any final thoughts anyone wishes to share?
Well, Hal, considering that this is an ongoing debate even beyond gaming, the perpetuity of moral evaluation, I think RDR2 offers a rare opportunity for players to confront their own ethics, albeit within a limited, predetermined framework. It sparks conversations like ours, and that in itself is valuable.
To wrap up, it's clear that in our discussion of RDR2, there's appreciation for the ethical dimension it adds to gaming, yet acknowledging that it doesn't, perhaps cannot, offer a complete representation of the true complexity of moral life. Thank you all for such a fiery yet enlightening exchange. Now, let's turn our focus to the narrative. RDR2 isn't just a game, It's a storytelling marvel that rivals cinema and literature. Jasper, you've often spoken about the game's cinematic qualities. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, Hal. Rockstar Games has unambiguously looked to filmmakers for inspiration. The sweeping panoramas, the lingering close-ups, even the use of weather transitions scream of cinematic technique. They're blurring the lines between games and movies in a way that enriches the storytelling.
I have to jump in here, Jasper, because you've made an excellent point. The narrative structure of RDR2 bears a striking resemblance to serialized novels, too. Scenes unfold like chapters, allowing players to immerse themselves in a slowly developing character arc, just as you would with a Dickens or Tolstoy.
That's a fascinating parallel, Amelia. Literature has always had a way of delving deep into characters' psyche, much like RDR2 does with Arthur Morgan.
It's true. There's a real depth to Arthur's character that we...
Hang on. I appreciate the literary and cinematic nods, but we're giving Rockstar too much credit. Don't you feel sometimes these devices can get in the way of gameplay? It's not always seamless.
Now, Lenny, I do see what you're saying in terms of pacing, perhaps, but can't you agree that sometimes it's precisely these cinematic moments that make us truly connect to Arthur's journey?
I'm with Jasper on this. The deliberate pacing gives weight to those climactic moments, much like a well-crafted novel.
Compelling narratives require this kind of care, don't they? Now, looping back to some of our philosophical touchpoints, I find the narrative is deeply existential. It's not simply about morality, but the quest for meaning in an encroaching modern world.
Philosophically deep or not, the game's ability to pivot from tranquility to chaos is something quite literary.
Oh, undeniably, Lenny. It's incredible how RDR2's story adopts the ebb and flow of human emotion, much like the classics.
And let's not forget how Rockstar uses the open world to complement the story. Explorative freedom can serve as an introspective journey for players themselves, paralleling Arthur's own.
True, but that freedom also dilutes the authorial voice. Does an open world compromise the integrity of a singular narrative vision?
Depends on perspective. In literature, ambiguity is an asset. Here in RDR2, player agency creates a narrative that's uniquely personal.
Which in a way mirrors life itself. The game offers a philosophical commentary on the human condition through those very choices.
Spot on, Hal. Player agency is the evolution of reader response theory from literature, no longer just interpreting a narrative, but shaping it.
It's a gamble that pays off, though I still question whether it reaches the narrative heights of film and literature.
And that question propels us further into the discussion, doesn't it? Whether RDR2 is a novel or a film that you live and breathe, a testament to its narrative power. Welcome back to the Roundtable. Now we turn to realism versus playability in RDR2. It's a game that prides itself on a detailed living world, but we also want it to be fun. Lenny, care to kick us off on how the game maintains this delicate balance?
Certainly, Hal. The first thing that strikes me is the game's insistence on realism, even in mundane activities like grooming your horse. This meticulous representation is enjoyable to an extent, but I wonder if meticulousness can sometimes come at the expense of playability.
That's a valid point, Lenny. However, those details also contribute to a sense of immersion. The game's intention is not just to entertain, but to transport players to another time and place, and that's something RDR2 does exceptionally well.
I have to agree with Izzy there, and yet as someone fascinated by biomedical science, I'm both impressed and slightly bemused by the game's health and stamina system. It's scientifically simplified, of course, but that's necessary. You want a game, not a biology lesson.
Simplified, yes, but sometimes too forgiving. I mean, downing a health tonic instantly heals bullet wounds. It's a game, I get it, but it somewhat undermines the survival aspect, doesn't it?
I see your point, Lenny, but it's a game mechanism that serves a broader purpose, keeping the narrative flow unimpeded. These concessions are vital for maintaining narrative momentum, which is as important as realism.
That's right, Izzy, and let's not forget the cultural immersion. These mechanics also serve to narrate the rugged life in the Old West. When you must hunt for food or cook it, you feel more like a part of that world.
Exactly, Jazz, and it's these moments that build a bond between the player and Arthur, creating a more profound storytelling experience.
But do you not find, Jasper, the hunting exemplary of this reality versus playability issue? It's authentic, sure, but also repetitive. It risks losing the player's interest if overdone.
Well, Lenny, repetition can be meditative. It becomes part of the rhythm of the game's world. Think of it like the dedication to practice in science or an art form.
Meditation aside, let me say I appreciate your points on realism, Lenny. You have a knack for cutting through to the heart of gameplay mechanics.
Thank you, Izzy. I just think there's a more delicate balance to strike. I mean, if we push too far towards realism, why not have Arthur file his tax return?
Well, I must say, the debate here echoes historical tensions between practicality and artistic aspiration. It's clear that RDR2's design choices have opened up rich avenues for discussion. Let's hold on to that thought as we steer our horses towards the portrayal of Native Americans in the next segment. Thank you all for a lively debate. Welcome back to our roundtable. Today we're delving into the depiction of Native Americans in RDR2. Amelia, your knowledge on historical narratives is vast. Could you start us off on how you think the game handled this delicate subject?
Certainly, Hal. In many ways, RDR2 attempts to offer a more nuanced portrayal of Native Americans, one that strives to respect their culture and acknowledge their struggles during the era. Compared to the monolithic depictions in some older Western literature, there's progress.
I agree with Amelia to some extent, but there's much left to be desired. The game does incorporate the encroachment of modernity on Native American lands and ways of life, which is historically accurate. However, their representation still borders on the trope of the noble savage, which can be rather troubling.
Mick, you're spot on. Despite the effort to avoid stereotypes, the game falls into the trap of romanticizing and simultaneously victimizing Native Americans. It's a complex issue that I feel RDR2 doesn't fully succeed in addressing.
That's a fair assessment, Izzy. In the literary world, these depictions have long been challenged and reconsidered.
But let's not understate the attempts made. A respectful dialogue was initiated with Native American consultants during the game's development, which differentiates RDR2 from its less thoughtful predecessors.
True, involving consultants is a step forward, but arguably it can sometimes serve as more of a tick-box exercise than a real drive for the authenticity and depth of representation.
The intention versus the impact seems to be a recurring theme here. Izzy, how do you perceive the game's influence on contemporary cultural understandings of Native Americans?
RDR2 can either pave the way for a more informed portrayal or reinforce outdated cliches. Unfortunately, sometimes it does the latter. While the game promotes some empathetic understandings, it risks leaving players with oversimplified notions about Native American history and culture.
Well, it's a mixed bag. The game does push players to confront the historical consequences of colonialism, which is more than can be said for many other cultural depictions.
Even then, it's something of an aside in the narrative, potentially a missed opportunity for greater educational impact. We're speaking about the lives and cultures of peoples decimated by the very era we are so fondly recreating here.
Jasper, you've been quiet. Any input on how the game's technological prowess relates to this discussion?
The game's environments are immersive, and they did a fantastic job with the landscape, which is deeply tied to native cultures. But an accurate backdrop can't make up for shortcomings in storytelling.
Exactly, Jasper. The environment serves as a passive document of the time, distilling a broader truth about dispossession and cultural erosion. But is that enough? Or does it serve as a mere decoration to a narrative that's primarily about the outlaws?
Ideally, it should enrich the narrative. The attention to environmental detail sets a stage where more meaningful stories could be told. They've crafted the canvas beautifully. It's the painting itself that we're scrutinizing.
And scrutinize we must. It seems we're coming to the consensus that while RDR2 makes commendable attempts to acknowledge and portray Native Americans, the execution is at times wanting in depth and agency. Thank you for this spirited discussion, panelists. Let's move on to the environmental storytelling and its impact on the world building within the game in our next segment. Mick, lead us off with your thoughts on the game's setting and how that influences the storytelling. Now let's discuss the lush environment of Red Dead Redemption 2. The game manages to tell its story not only through dialogue or action, but also through the world itself. Jasper, could you start us off with how the game's technological innovations enable such an interactive environment?
Certainly, Hal. RDR2 is a prime example of environmental storytelling done right. The attention to detail Rockstar Games implemented is astounding. They've managed to simulate an ecosystem that's both dynamic and responsive. From the weather systems to the wildlife patterns, it helps to create a believable and lived-in world. This isn't just a backdrop, it's a character in its own right.
I quite agree, Jasper. Their representation of nature and use of historical landmarks give players an unparalleled sense of immersion. But it's more than just a technical marvel. The game captures the frontier's soul, incorporating myths and stories that were part of 19th century America. The geographical accuracy is commendable, especially considering the game's open-world format.
Absolutely, Mick. The game's landscapes are like a love letter to the romantic poets and painters who glorified the natural world. They've managed to translate that 19th century awe into digital form, which is quite a feat. Remember the first time you ride into the Grizzlies and the score swells as the mountains rise around you? Pure poetry.
I couldn't agree more. Yet, as much as we praise the environmental storytelling, I must say, sometimes the game stands at odds with user experience. For instance, you could be in the middle of admiring a sunset when a random bear attack happens. It's true to the unpredictability of the frontier life, I guess, but it can be jarring.
That's a valid point, Jasper, but also what makes RDR2's world building so effective. The unpredictability you mentioned is what kept the players on the edge of their seats back then, and it's captured well in RDR2. In a sense, it's an authentic representation of the perils of the frontier.
True. But I might add that these random encounters also serve to propel the narrative forward, giving players unique stories to share. That's where the world building really becomes storytelling.
Indeed, RDR2 illuminates how environment and narrative are inextricably linked, how the landscape is intertwined with the characters' lives, turning our attention to the historical aspect.
Before we dive into that, Hal, let's not forget how the game leverages technology to serve the narrative. The dynamic weather system, the changing seasons, they all aren't just visual elements. They act as metaphors for the themes of change and decay throughout the story.
Jasper, while I applaud the game's technological prowess, wouldn't you say that at times it feels as though the game is more interested in flaunting its technical achievements than in serving the narrative?
Mick, I have to interject there. I think the game lays out an incredible canvas that draws us into its narrative. The environment nudges players to explore moral complexities and historical realities of that time.
Interesting perspectives, everyone. As we continue to analyze how environmental elements influence storytelling, it's clear that Red Dead Redemption 2 provides us with an effective and evocative marriage of narrative and technology. Let's now delve into the portrayal of the Old West spirit and consider how this has both celebrated and critiqued the era. So, let's get into the gritty expanse of the Wild West as depicted in RDR2. The game feels like a love letter to classic Western films, doesn't it?
Absolutely, Hal. It's a detailed homage. You see it in the sweeping landscapes, the jewels, even the nuances of the outlaw lifestyle. It's clear the game developers studied the genre intensely.
I'd have to agree. The game definitely captures the essence of those films. There's a sense of nostalgia in every scene. When you roam the open world, it's like you're stepping into a John Ford movie.
They do, Izzy. However, the game also runs the risk of perpetuating the romanticized noble outlaw stereotype, which we have to be careful of, as it can oversimplify complex historical realities.
Sure, the stereotype exists, Lenny, but isn't the goal to engage players in a narrative experience? RDR2 uses these tropes effectively to do just that, whilst also delivering its own unique story. Well, Jasper, it's a double-edged sword. While it does engage, it also carries the responsibility of how it informs or misinforms players about that era. Even if it's fictional, cultural nuances matter.
To build on Izzy's point, there's more than just the story of the outlaw. There's sentimentality in landscapes, character struggles, even the interpersonal conflict, much like the gritty revisionist westerns of the 70s.
True, but some might argue that it swims in the shallow end of nostalgia, rather than offering a more accurate critique of the American frontier myth. I think this is a valid concern.
It is, but it also cleverly subverts some of those classic tropes. The treatment of Native Americans, for example, diverges from the typical Western film portrayals, giving us a more nuanced perspective.
That's a fair point, Mick, but we have to recognize that its portrayal is dualistic. It venerates the genre, yet it doesn't always escape the trappings of its conventions. It's progressive in some aspects, and yet still constrained by the genre's history in others.
When you say constrained, are we not perhaps underestimating the player's ability to critically engage with the material? RDR2 is a cultural text, yes, but it's also a canvas for interpretation.
I understand what you're saying, Jasper, and it's an optimistic view. But let's not forget the power of these images and tropes. They aren't just passively consumed, they shape perceptions.
And that's a brilliant discussion. Nuanced perspectives indeed. It seems, like any powerful art, RDR2 reflects, refracts, and sometimes distorts the mirror it holds up to history and culture. Would you say it's fair to give the game credit for balancing these complexities?
To a degree, Hal, but balance implies equal representation. The game is groundbreaking in many ways, but it also remains fundamentally a pastiche of the films that inspired it, which brings its own set of limitations.
And yet the game opens up space for conversations like this one. And that in itself is the sign of an influential work, even if it falls short in some areas.
I think we've all made some profound observations here. It seems RDR2, akin to the Western genre it pays tribute to, stands at a crossroads between legacy and evolution. Shall we ride on to our next topic? Let's delve into the character arc of Arthur Morgan. RDR2 provides us with a deep, complex portrayal that's rare in video gaming. The moral ambiguity, the responsibility he carries, it's almost a Shakespearean tragedy. Arthur's development demonstrates that a video game's protagonist can be as profound as any character from classic literature. Thoughts?
I agree, Hal. There's a definite literary quality to Arthur. He's not just a digital avatar. He's a man with a past, a conscience, at war with his own fate. There's a parallel to the Byronic hero, flawed, yet captivating. Arthur's evolution isn't just a plot mechanism, it enriches the whole narrative tapestry.
I hear you on the Byronic hero aspect, Amelia, and it's a spot-on comparison. But beyond the literary aspect, I appreciate the cultural weight of Arthur's character. He's a product of his time, struggling with personal redemption amidst the decline of the Wild West. It's both a personal journey and a reflection on societal shifts.
He's certainly a microcosm of the changing times.
I must say, despite the excellent narrative groundwork, there's a mechanical side that bothers me. Arthur's development is influenced by player choice, but at times the gameplay fails to reflect the gravity of his decisions. The interactivity can't always capture the nuance of his psychological journey.
I've got to jump in and disagree, Jasper. Sure, there are limitations, but isn't that the beauty of the medium? Players inhabit Arthur, making choices that resonate with their morality, which in turn affects how his story unfolds. It becomes a personal introspection for the player as well.
Izzy, you echo my sentiment exactly. And his relationships...
Absolutely. His interactions with the Van der Linde gang, they might be my favorite part. You see the layers of loyalty, friendship, betrayal. It's pure narrative gold.
It's interesting how he embodies the gang's ethos, yet frequently confronts it. Gives us quite a dialectical perspective on his character, doesn't it?
Dialectical, yes, but a bit overextended on occasions, Hal. While I admire the craft behind Arthur's character, I believe his internal conflicts are often more told than shown, which can be a slight diminution in his portrayal.
Ever the skeptic, Lenny. While I concede that sometimes the narrative takes overt precedence, the subtleties of Arthur's expression, the voice acting, his scribbles in the journal, those little details, they show an inner life that's rich and poignant.
And let's not overlook his dreams. Those sequences add a layer of unconscious struggle that's rarely seen in games.
They were quite revealing, but it seems we can agree that Arthur Morgan's character brings unparalleled depth to the world of video gaming.
Absolutely. I think we're witnessing a new era of character development in gaming, with Arthur leading the charge.
I can't dispute that, even with my reservations. Arthur Morgan will be remembered as one of the great characters of video gaming history. No doubt about it.
A fitting testament to a character that has, in many ways, redefined what it means to play a role in a video game. His journey will undoubtedly be analyzed and appreciated for years to come. Let's turn our attention to Segment 9, the representation of women and gender roles in the late 19th century setting of Red Dead Redemption 2. Izzy, your critiques often shed light on layers many of us overlook. How do you perceive the portrayal of women in the game?
Well, Hal, I have mixed feelings. The women in RDR2 are certainly not just damsels in distress or background decorations. They have agency and compelling stories. Take Sadie Adler, for instance. She's a fantastic character who subverts many of those typical Western tropes. But I'm vexed by the limited scope. Women's stories often circle back to trauma or revenge. It's nuanced, but not quite revolutionary.
I have to compliment you on highlighting Sadie, Izzy. I agree completely. Her journey resembles a Victorian novel's heroine. Think of Mina Harker in Dracula. Still strong, yet ultimately defined by the men around her. However, Abigail Marston is an embodiment of resilience and the desire for a peaceful life, which aligns with some narrative arcs we see in literature of the time.
An astute observation, Amelia. But I'm not convinced the portrayal is as limited as you both suggest. If we consider the contextual accuracy, women's suffrage was gaining momentum. The game includes these stirrings of change, as with the character of Mrs. Calhoun, the suffragette. It's a nod to the realities of the era.
Mick, while it's true that suffrage is represented, the issue is more about depth and breadth. The game could explore the various complexities of womanhood at the time more expansively. It still leans heavily on archetypes.
I have to interject here, Izzy. The game does explore the complexities you're referring to, just perhaps not as overtly as you'd prefer. For instance, the simple act of Mary Beth writing or Tilly's quiet strength against her traumatic past offer those layers of complexity without heroics.
Exactly. Moreover, when you roam the world, you see women who are shopkeepers, ranchers, roles that defy the traditional confines of the domestic sphere. Isn't that representative of the gradual shift in gender roles?
It represents Mick, but it doesn't delve deeply. It's one thing to place a character in a role, and another to unravel their narrative in a way that reflects their struggles and triumphs in a man's world. That's the nuance that's sometimes missing in RDR2.
Izzy, I see your point, and I admire your passion for more depth. But in the constraints of a video game, even an expansive one like RDR2, might it be a challenge to capture every nuance?
Challenges should be embraced, Hal, especially if a game sets itself up as a storytelling pioneer. We celebrate what RDR2 does well, but can we not also call for it to push further?
She has a point, Hal. We run the risk of complacency if we don't ask for more. Literature has taught us that each story is an opportunity for a multitude of voices to be heard. RDR2 has moments of brilliance, and I think Izzy wants those moments to be the rule, not the exception.
True, each narrative is a chance to deepen our understanding, whether we are dissecting a novel or playing through a video game's storyline. This is why the discussions we have are vital, to recognize room for growth even in well-crafted tales. Mick, you must see where Izzy is coming from.
I do see your perspective, Izzy, and Amelia, your points are well taken. It's imperative that we recognize the progress made, but still hold the creators to account for areas where they could, perhaps, amp up the authenticity. History is rich, and so should be our representations of it in all media.
Thank you, Mick. I suppose that even mentioning the missions and actions that explore these themes is a step in the right direction. But as you say, there's always room to push the envelope.
I think we can all agree that striving for more multifaceted characters, settings, and stories is a worthy pursuit. As we wind down our discussion on the representation of women and gender roles in RDR2, it's clear that while the game may have taken steps forward, we eagerly anticipate even greater strides in the future of gaming narratives. Shall we move on? Welcome back to our roundtable discussion on Red Dead Redemption 2. We're moving on to something a bit wilder now. Segment 10, focusing on the game's use of wildlife and hunting mechanics. Jasper, you have a background in both the biological sciences and film. Can you begin by sharing how you think the game's ecosystem functions scientifically?
Absolutely, Hal. RDR2 invests deeply in an ecosystem that functions with remarkable scientific integrity. The behaviors of wildlife, from migration patterns to predator-prey interactions, showcase not just programming artistry, but also a commitment to ecological realism. It's a microcosm of nature, really.
I must say, Jasper, I admire the nuance you've noticed. And to your point, from an anthropological angle, the game captures the essence of hunting practices and their significance in the late 19th century, not just as a means of survival, but also as a deeply rooted cultural activity.
Totally agree, Mick, and hats off to the game developers for how they've modeled AI behaviors. But the hunting, it's more than just aim and shoot, it's a whole intricate dance. And yet, despite the game's pedantic attention to detail, I sometimes wonder if the extensive tracking and studying of animals interfere with the pacing of the game. It's a bit of a tightrope walk between authenticity and playability.
That's a fair critique, Lenny. However, I see these mechanics as narrative tools. They encourage players to interact with the game world in a more respectful, measured way. It's a portal to understanding the Native American relationship with nature, which was all about balance and respect. Remember,
I'm glad you brought that up, Izzy. The game indeed prompts reflection on our place in the natural world, and that in itself is a triumph in storytelling. But Mick, do you think the game succeeds in presenting an unvarnished truth about hunting and its impact on the environment and Native American life?
Well, I find myself in two minds here. The attention to detail is commendable, certainly a feather in RDR2's cap. Nevertheless, I'm not convinced it entirely escapes the romanticized notion of the noble hunter. This is a recurring issue in many Western narratives, and RDR2 doesn't quite break out of that mold.
Mick, I see your point, and it's a significant one. The portrayal can sometimes walk the line of pastiche, yet doesn't that also challenge players to consider the historical context and the consequences these activities had on the real world?
Indeed, it's a matter of balance and perspective. The historical aspect meshes with an ecological consciousness that wasn't really a part of the public discourse in the game's time period. Though I can't help but applaud the game for making players deliberate about the repercussions of their actions within the natural world.
And not to overshadow your profound observation, Hal, but I find it scientifically groundbreaking. The game's simulation of ecology isn't just about hunting, it's about coexistence and consequence. That's evolution in gameplay mechanics if I've ever seen one.
Evolution, Jasper, is quite the term to use. And while I concur on the mechanics shaping a multifaceted ecosystem, I still yearn for mechanics that do not occasionally pull me out of the narrative flow. It's an immersion versus mechanics debate that RDR2 juggles continuously.
Lenny, you do know how to throw a wrench, don't you? But it's not misplaced. Nevertheless, the game does afford players a vast canvas to experience the wilderness, and this is closer to living history than most will ever get.
Absolutely, Mick. It's a virtual environmental odyssey. And it's those moments of tranquility when you're out in the virtual frontier that RDR2 captures something more, a sense of connection to a world that once was.
Profound insights all around. The ecological design of RDR2 is complex, educational, and at times contentious. What's clear, though, is that its portrayal of wildlife and hunting is as much a tribute to the past as it is a commentary on our present relationship with nature. Let's ponder on that as we ride into our final segment. As we approach the end of our vibrant discussion, it's time we each offer our final thoughts on the masterpiece that is Red Dead Redemption 2. Its cultural impact and legacy are undeniable. Who would like to start us off with their concluding reflections?
I'll jump in. Red Dead Redemption 2 is indeed a narrative tour de force, a beacon of literary and cultural references seamlessly interwoven into its rich tapestry. The breathtaking scope of its story and the depth of its world invite parallels with the finest novels of any era. It's been thrilling to dissect these connections with you all.
I echo your sentiments on the narrative aspect, Amelia. Yet, considering the technological achievements, RDR2 is a pivotal moment in gaming history. The environmental storytelling and realistic wildlife dynamics, they're practically a quantum leap in interactive media. Mick, your points about the historical landmarks were especially enlightening in that regard.
Thank you, Jasper. Although the game isn't perfect, its dedication to historical immersion is admirable. I must say, Izzy, your critique of the representation of Native Americans sparked a very necessary conversation. The game tries to respect history, but there's definitely room for growth and sensitivity.
Absolutely, Mick. And while we're on the topic of growth, the portrayal of gender roles and women's agency in RDR2 deserves scrutiny. Yes, it fits the historical context, but as creators of media, there's a responsibility to challenge old narratives, not just replicate them, even in historical settings.
You raise a critical issue, Izzy. And let's not forget the question of realism and playability, an aspect where RDR2 walks a razor-thin line. Amelia, your literary ties added so much to this conversation, but please, let's not gloss over the potential frustration of players with too much realism, shall we?
Of course, Lenny. The balance is delicate, and Rockstar did wobble on that tightrope occasionally. However, this didn't detract from the overall immersive experience. Speaking of immersion, Jasper's insights on biomedical realism added a fascinating layer to our roundtable.
It's all about striking that balance you mentioned, Amelia. And let me add, Hal, I've been intrigued by your philosophical takes. Your analysis of Arthur Morgan's existential journey was particularly enlightening. It's a strong testament to the game's layered character development.
The credit goes to the collective wisdom of this table, Jasper. I only navigated the terrain you've all so meticulously charted. It's evident that Red Dead Redemption 2 provides not just a playground for gamers, but also a canvas for profound intellectual and cultural discourse. Lenny, you've been especially vocal about narrative and design choices. Any parting shots?
Indeed, Hal. My parting shot, no pun intended, is a reminder that while RDR2 is groundbreaking, we must never cease to critique and prompt progress, fostering a more culturally aware and nuanced gaming landscape. This discussion, with all its differing viewpoints, stands as a beacon of constructive debate.
Beautifully articulated, everyone. The legacy of Red Dead Redemption 2 will undoubtedly be shaped by the discussions it inspires, much like the one we've had today. I thank you all for sharing your insights and hope the paths we've traversed today in conversation will guide us into enlightened pastures tomorrow. Cheers to Red Dead Redemption 2 and to each of you for adding to the rich dialogue around it.